There we go, the meeting's being recorded. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Evaluation Basics for Non-Evaluators. Let me do some introductions today and tell you a little bit about our system. First, I'm Mike Wosecki on the left with Luca Partners. I'll be the moderator for the webinar today, and I also serve on Evaluate's Community College Liaison panel. In the middle of the screen is Lori Wingate. She's the main presenter for this webinar, and she's the director of Evaluate, which is located at the Evaluation Center at Western Michigan University. On the right is Elaine Kraft. Elaine is the principal investigator of Mentor Connect, and she will be sharing tales from the evaluation trenches at various points throughout the webinar. By the way, at any time during this webinar, you can download both the slides and the handout from today's webinar. You can see them. The arrow is pointing to them, thank you, on the right-hand side of the screen. So click on them at any time. Now let me tell you a little bit about the people that make this happen behind the scenes. We'd like to acknowledge our colleagues, including Emma Perk from Evaluate, Cynthia Williams, Evaluate's editor from Style Sheets, and joining me at Luca Partners are Janet Pinhorn and Shannon Payne. Thank you, colleagues. This webinar is brought to you by Evaluate, the Evaluation Support Center for the National Science Foundation's Advanced Technological Education Program. We know that as ATE. Evaluate serves the ATE community and others by holding webinars like this one on evaluation and maintaining an open access resource library, curating a blog about STEM education evaluating, and collecting and disseminating data about the ATE program. Be sure to check out the Evaluate website. You can see it there, evalu-8.org. And by the way, speaking of webinars, join us next month for our next in the series titled Creating One-Page Reports, a Strategy for Engaging Busy Readers. That's going to be on April 15th at 1 p.m. Eastern again, and you can register and check out more details at evaluate.org. Mentor Connect. It's also supported by the National Science Foundation's ATE program. Mentor Connect provides mentoring and technical support to help community colleges prepare competitive ATE grant proposals for the improvement of technician education. Mentor Connect is developing STEM faculty leaders as well, broadening the diversity of grantees in the ATE program. This webinar is hosted by ATE Central, which is an information hub for the National Science Foundation ATE grantee community. Thank you, ATE Central. And as I mentioned, the materials from this webinar, the slides and the handout, are available on the right-hand side of the screen, and the recording plus links to those materials will be sent to you automatically after the meeting ends. It usually takes about 2 days for us to get that information out. Let me go ahead and turn over the webinar now to our main presenter, Lori Wingate. Go ahead, Lori.
Well, thank you, Mike, very much. So here I am in my natural habitat, and I'm really excited to have you all here with us today to talk about evaluation and learn about evaluation, maybe for the first time. We're going to pack a lot into the next hour, so I want to make sure you really stay tuned and ready to jump in, because we have a lot of interactivity today as well as question breaks built into the webinar. So if a question comes into your mind at any time, just go ahead and put it in the chat box. Mike is going to keep track of those, and we'll address them at one of the 3 question breaks we have planned. As Mike mentioned, I am Director of Evaluate, and Evaluate is funded by NSF to provide guidance on evaluation matters. However, I want you to make sure you understand that does not mean I speak for NSF, and the same goes for Mike and Elaine. NSF's Advanced Technological Education program is focused on improving technician education mainly through 2-year colleges. The program funds centers, targeted research, conferences and workshops, and several different types of projects, as you can see here. We've worked with Mentor Connect to bring this webinar to you today, And Mentor Connect's main focus is getting institutions who have not been funded by ATE into the program. So the examples I'll share today are about that type of project. That is, projects that are funded for up to $225,000 for 3 years that take place at colleges that are new to the ATE program. But a lot of what we'll cover today will apply to evaluation in all kinds of contexts. And on that note, I'd like to know more about where you all are coming from. And anytime you see in a moment, you're going to see a gold border around the slide. Yeah, whenever you see something like that, it means you're going to be asked to do something. It might be a poll like this or use the chat. So answer this poll to indicate which statement best describes you or your team. Maybe you already have an ATE grant, or you're going to submit your first one this fall. Maybe you're funded through a different NSF program or going to apply to a different NSF program, or maybe you're not involved with NSF at all, and that's just fine. So let's see who we have here. So far, about a third of you aren't involved with NSF. I think you're still going to find a lot of the information they provide that's relevant. And a good number of you already have an ATE grant. And a fair number, over 20, who are just planning to submit their first grant to the ATE program. Great, we have a nice mix. Thanks for doing that poll, and now you know how to do polls. Well, this webinar is, as you can tell from the title, mainly for people who are really trying to wrap their heads around program evaluation for the first time. So I'm curious how many of you fit that profile. So you can raise your hand. There's a little guy with a or gal with a raised hand just above the slide area. So you can raise your hand to indicate if evaluation is something that really is new to you. And I'm seeing 40 and growing of people who are new to evaluation. The numbers are going up fast, so I think we're going to get quite a lot of people that this is all new to. And for all of you, please don't hesitate. If something is confusing or you don't understand, raise your put your question in the chat box, and we will definitely answer it at those breaks. Well, regardless of where you're coming from or how much experience you have already, I hope you'll come away from this webinar having learned something new. And you'll have a chance to tell us how much you think you learned and what you thought of this webinar in a survey at the end of the session. So I hope you'll please stick around for that. Even if you've come to a lot of our webinars and done a lot of our surveys, this survey is new and improved. So we're really hoping we're going to get a lot of people to respond to that. All right, thanks. So we can lower those hands now, Mike, if you want to clear that. To start off, I want to introduce you to Jen Erickson. So she's going to help us work through the basics of evaluation so you can all leave this webinar feeling confident about building evaluation into your projects. Well, Jen has a great idea for an ATE project. She and her team are going to implement what's called Intrusive Advising across the college's technical programs and train their advisors on how to use this approach to make sure no students fall through the cracks of academia. The college is seeing a lot of dropouts among first-generation students in technical programs, so they're going to develop resource materials and strategies to support those students and really help them succeed regardless of the kinds of barriers they're facing in completing their education. And finally, they're also going to create a new tech prep course, which is going to help students in technical programs develop in the areas of critical thinking, teamwork skills, and resilience. And they expect these activities to lead to increases in the number of students graduating with technical degrees or transferring to 4-year STEM programs. And STEM, is, for those of you who may not know, is science, technology, engineering, and math. Well, Jen and her team feel like they have a pretty good idea for a project that meets a real need in their college. Now she's reading over the ATE program solicitation, which is the document NSF puts out to describe the program to people and tell them how to apply. She comes across this section on evaluation, and it states that all projects carry out evaluative activities. Well, she's never had an NSF grant, and she's not entirely sure what they mean by evaluative activities. In fact, she has a lot of questions, like what do they even mean by evaluation? This project isn't going to have a big budget. How much is it going to cost? Why do we have to do it? Who is going to do it? Where do I even put it in my grant proposal? And what happens? How is this going to affect my project after we get funded. Well, let's start with that most basic question of what evaluation is. Now, if we looked up the word in the dictionary, we'd find a definition like this. But that's not going to tell you a whole lot about what NSF or any other funder really means by program evaluation. Now, if you've been wondering why I'm using this little elephant for this question, here's why. You probably know the story about a group of people around an elephant, and they can't see the whole elephant. They can only feel different parts of it. And each is pretty certain they know what it is based on the part of it that they're experiencing. And I found evaluation is a lot like that. So when I tell people where I work, which is the Evaluation Center at Western Michigan University, they'll say things like, oh, so you do the course evaluations, or do you do surveys, or is that like auditing? And while each of those things may be a part of or related to an evaluation process, none of them really give the overall picture of what evaluation is. So boiled down, it's going to involve at least these 4 steps. First, it's going to involve asking important questions about a project's processes or implementation, its outcomes, or other dimensions. And this is about making sure the evaluation is focusing on things that really matter. The next step is gathering evidence that will help answer those questions. And then you have to make sense of that information, of those data, so you interpret the results and answer the questions. And then the last step is to reporting and using that information for things like accountability and improvement and planning. But that's not really a final step because the evaluation can then inform decisions about the next project. Now we can drill down a little bit into what each of these entails. So yes, those questions may be about whether goals were achieved. That's quite common. But they can also focus on a project's implementation, measuring outcomes like changes in the target population, or even looking at the sustainability of the project. Now, one of the guys in that cartoon had equated evaluation with research, and yes, evidence for evaluation is often gathered using traditional research methods like focus groups, interviews, surveys, observations, even experimental designs. And in the ATE program, evaluations often utilize a college's institutional data. They may use results from course evaluations, and sometimes includes feedback from panels of experts or advisors. Now, when it comes to interpreting or making meaning of the data that were collected, evaluations almost always look for project strengths and weaknesses. In assessing outcomes, we're always going to want to also check the magnitude of those outcomes and their practical significance for the people involved. And those results can be used to report to our sponsors, to make improvements to a project as it's being implemented, to plan new projects. It'll show evidence of our capability if we go to seek new funding. And lessons learned from the evaluation can also help build a discipline's knowledge base about the effectiveness of different types of interventions. But this is all still pretty general, so let's go back to our friend Jen's project. To begin planning the evaluation of her project, she'll need to map out how the activities that she and her team are planning are going to bring about the changes that they want to see for their students at their college. So a good way to do that is to develop what's called a logic model. It's just a graphic depiction of what's going to happen in the project and how it's going to bring about change. So the ATE program doesn't require logic models. Some programs do and some funders do. But many people find them useful for thinking through what a project is going to do and also to use that model to communicate the plan to others. So this webinar isn't about building logic models. We're going to use it as a tool. So I'm just going to go ahead and build Jen's logic model for her. But as I'm doing that, I'd like you to start thinking about what questions you think the evaluation should address. So first, we've plugged in those activities that we know are part of the project plan. Then we'll put the outcomes that they know that they want to achieve, which are to increase the number of graduates who either transfer to STEM programs at four-year colleges or enter the technical workforce. Then we need to connect those pieces. So based on research, they think that these activities are going to lead to more students passing technical courses and staying enrolled in the college. And if those short-term outcomes are achieved, then the college will see more students persisting in their technical programs and graduating with marketable technical credentials, which they can use either to transfer to four-year STEM programs or enter the workforce. So now that you can see this project mapped out, even if you don't know anything much more about evaluation than what I've just presented, what questions would you have about this? What suggestions can you give Jen for the kinds of things the evaluation might look at? And you can use the chat to put in your suggestions. Okay, Max is wanting to know the industry perspective. Very good. So ATE programs are supposed to meet an industry need. So that would be an important thing to consider, and which is kind of after those long-term outcomes. Is industry hiring the graduates? Are they satisfied? Okay, Vicky's pointing out, like, are these activities really meeting the needs of students? That's very important. I mean, if you miss the mark on what the need is, it's going to fall flat, right? Anne is suggesting looking at national trends. So once we get to, how are other programs doing? How are things doing nationally in terms of these types of interventions? Rachel's suggesting looking at, and we don't have resources and inputs in our logic model, but that's a good question. Which resources and strategies are most effective? Oh, that would be the type of interventions. Tara's asking about scalability and sustainability. Excellent. So you're honing right in on this. You're connecting with the kinds of things we might want to find out from an evaluation. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing those. So here's what I came up with on my own, and which is never the best way to come up with evaluation questions. Always good to talk to different people and talk to stakeholders. So to make sure that project is on track for making a difference for students, the question I would ask first would focus on the project's design and implementation. I'd want to know to what extent that course and the resources and the advising strategy are really meeting the needs of students, as some of you had honed in on. Now, I would break that down into sub-questions when we plan data collection, but that's the general question I would ask about the activities. Then I move to that first level of outcomes. I'd want to determine the extent to which the project is impacting student success in the courses, that's question 2, and their ability to navigate college and stay enrolled, which is question 3. And these will come back in a minute. Next, I'd suggest looking at how the project is impacting that persistence in technical programs, that's question 4, and how it's affecting program completion rates, question 5. I actually wouldn't go out to the next level for an evaluation question about the long-term outcomes, just because this is a short, project has a short duration of 3 years. So if we went with this set of questions, we'd have 5 overarching evaluation questions addressing both the project's process or implementation and its outcomes. And we'd want to use a mix of qualitative and quantitative data from multiple sources to actually answer those questions. Just as a caveat, we're not going to get into the details of data collection now, but that's the big picture. Now, if you want to know more about logic models, we just touched on them briefly, we have a couple of resources in our handout that you might want to check out. The first is a logic model template, and that's tailored to the ATE program. And the second is a webinar we have that demonstrates how to really, goes into the details of developing a logic model as well as using it in a grant proposal. Now, that final resource you see there, if you want to learn more about the quality of good evaluation checklist, evaluation questions, you can see the checklist that I created on this topic with my colleague Daniela Schroeder. And links for all these resource materials that I'll mention in the webinar are on our handout. So Jen has a better sense now of what it means to have her project evaluated, but it's actually more involved than she kind of thought it was. So now she's concerned about how much it's going to cost, and we're going to get to that in just a bit. But first we're going to hear from Elaine, who has tons of experience in multiple roles as a leader of projects that have been evaluated, as well as a project evaluator, and as a mentor to new projects. So Elaine, go ahead.
Thanks, Lori. I really liked the picture of texting that you used in your sample project. It reminded me that it is important to understand how to communicate with your target audience. Since today I will be sharing some real-life examples of how PIs actually use evaluation data, I will start with a project that implemented strategies to increase minority retention and graduation rates in targeted technician programs. The project launched a series of seminars for project participants on topics such as time management skills and tips for studying and learning science. However, attendance at these sessions was very low, not reaching a fraction of their target audience. First, they tried changing the time that the seminars were offered. Unfortunately, attendance dropped further. From student surveys and interviews, the evaluator learned that student interest in the topics and desire to attend were high, but they couldn't because of conflicting classes, jobs, family responsibilities, transportation schedules, and other commitments. Other data also showed that students preferred receiving project information by way of cell phone, and they all seemed to have smartphones. The evaluator suggested that the project team consider capturing the seminars on video that could be pushed out to the project participants as podcasts that the students could access at any time. The project implemented this change, and the resulting self-help sessions became such a hit that access was expanded to reach all students at the college. Importantly, the project improved participation and outcomes for participants by acting on evaluation data and providing support in a way that worked for their target population of students. Now, let's go to Mike for some questions.
Thank you, Elaine. You know, you stressed communication there with participants in the program, but here's a question. It has to do with communication with your evaluator. How often should we as project people, during the project itself, how often do you communicate with the evaluator? Is it once a week, once a year? What do you find works?
Well, Mike, I definitely encourage communicating with your evaluator as you're preparing your proposal, and probably right up until the time you submit your proposal. For example, late changes to the project, which often occur as you try to match your plan with your budget, may throw you out of sync with the evaluation plan, and your evaluator will want to have an opportunity to realign the plan with your project. And you should always contact the evaluator when you hear from NSF. Hopefully, you will be getting questions from an NSF program officer that indicate that your proposal reviewed well and is being considered for funding. But even if it is a decline letter that you receive, meaning your proposal will not be funded this time, your evaluator will be very appreciative if you let him or her know. As you work with your evaluator, once you get a project funded, that's one of the first things you'll need to do is have that communications conversation. In the evaluation contract, it will probably spell out pretty clearly the frequency of site visits, for instance, when reports are going to be due, and the level of conversation that the evaluator and the project will have. Sometimes it can be adjustable depending on what's going on in the project, but more communication is certainly better than less in every case. Thanks, Mike.
One more for you, Elaine, and then I have a question for Lori. In the Mentor Connect program, can the mentor provide the role as external evaluator? I'm not sure exactly how that works myself.
No, we actually don't allow a mentor working with a specific team to then be the team's evaluator. However, we have a cadre of mentors. We use at least 10 all the time. And a mentor for different teams can be an evaluator for another one of our Mentor Connect teams. I hope that makes sense. In other words, you can't be the evaluator for the one whose project that you're working with them on, but you can be for another one of the Mentor Connect colleges.
That does make sense. Thank you. Lori, we have a question for you. In one of your slides, it referred to an independent evaluator. Now, you may address this later on in the talk, but is there a definition of what independent evaluator means?
Good question, and I can speak to NSF ATE program, not a global definition of independent evaluator, and we will talk about that a little bit later. But basically, the evaluator for an ATE project can be located at the same institution as the project. However, they have to be in a different unit that has a different reporting chain, and they should not have another role on the project in order to be considered independent. In general, we recommend to have a fully external, evaluator, somebody from outside the program. But it is okay to have that level of independence on ATE projects.
Good. In the interest of time, Lori, we're going to go ahead. There was a question that came in, is there a list of evaluators somewhere? And there is a link to that list that now just appeared in the chat window. So folks, we will be having another question break like this one coming up. Lori, take us forward into how much it will cost.
Absolutely. So good questions, and keep them coming. And now we're going to get to that burning question of how much a project evaluation costs. Well, here's that excerpt from the ATE program solicitation about the evaluation requirement, and it states that the evaluation budget must match the scope of the proposed evaluative activities. And that's certainly important, but not very satisfying for people who just want to get a figure into their budgets that they can work with, and maybe some of you can relate to that. Well, the general rule of thumb is that 10% of a project's costs should be allocated for evaluation, the project's value, and that's for evaluation in any context. And so that's just a good place to start. And then you can go up or down from there depending on what level of evaluation is needed for your particular project. But really, like the fact of the matter is, if you're going to have the evaluation bring value to your project, you do have to fund it adequately. So I don't recommend skimping it. Of course, I'm biased because I'm an evaluator. Now, if Jen asked for the maximum amount for projects funded through the new to ATE program, her grant would be $225,000. And if she dedicated 10% to evaluation, that would mean there would be $22,500 over 3 years for evaluation, or $7,500 per year. Now, these funds would go towards the evaluator's time and travel expenses. It's always a good idea for the evaluator to make site visits to the project, and the closer the evaluator lives, the lower the travel costs are going to be. So that means they're going to be able to provide more service to the project. So that's just something to keep in mind. Another major cost may be the evaluator's overhead rate. There may be other miscellaneous expenses, but these are going to be the main ones. The evaluation budget should really reflect what's needed for a given project. So again, this is just a very rough guideline. Frankly, Jen would rather use those funds for services that are going to have a direct impact on her students. So she's wondering why she should really spend money on evaluation. Well, the quick answer is she has to, because it's required by NSF. So it's a matter of compliance. And while that's reason enough, I think it helps to step back and consider why NSF may have this requirement. There really are good reasons to have your project evaluated, even if it isn't required. And for some of you who aren't involved in the AT program, that might be the case. In my opinion, there's 3 general purposes for evaluation: for accountability, improvement, and evidence. And we're going to walk through each of these, starting with improvement, because it's really the most important. As my first boss here at the Evaluation Center liked to say, the most important purpose of evaluation is not to prove, but to improve. Well, here's that logic model for Jen's project. This is how she and her team expect the project to work. But the evaluation results may show that it doesn't actually work the way they thought it would, for better or worse. And that information that the evaluation brings is going to provide insights on how to adjust the project's activities to maximize outcomes. And I'll share an example from another project, a real project, that was funded through NSF New to ATE program. The project was called Rebranding the 21st Century IT Technician, and the principal investigator was Asa Bradley at Spokane Community College. And she wrote a blog about her experience, and the link to that blog is on her handout. Her grant was aimed at increasing female enrollment and retention in her college's information systems program. And the project included a day-long camp for incoming 8th and 9th grade young women. Now, in the original plan, they had set aside money for 5 college students to help for 8 hours during the camp. And they ended up having more college students want to be involved than they expected. And those students brought more ideas and energy and leadership to the project than they anticipated. So the project's evaluation included a survey of those college student leaders, and it showed that nearly all of them believed that the camp experience increased their confidence as leaders and ability to work in teams. Asa wrote in her blog, "We were happy that we decided to work with an external evaluator. Because of the questions our evaluator asked, we have the data to justify moving resources around in our budget." So that's one example of how a project uses its evaluation results for improvement. So let's consider accountability. At the most basic level, evaluation enables a high degree of accountability. So individual grantees are held accountable for their use of federal resources, and the information helps NSF be accountable to Congress and justify continued support of the program. Projects funded by NSF have to submit reports annually to their program officers through an online system. It's called research.gov, and the main sections of that report are shown here. Now, in the accomplishments section, the grantees report on their project goals and activities, objectives, results, and outcomes. They have to report on at least some of those. Now, by now you can probably guess that those information about the project results and outcomes are going to come in large part from the evaluation. And this section is also where grantees are supposed to upload their evaluation reports, at least in the ATE program, so their NSF program officers can review them. Now, if a project encountered problems or saw opportunities to shift focus and improve a bit to maximize outcomes, just like ASA's did, the evidence to substantiate that change in plans can be included in the sections this section here called Changes and Problems. So in addition to providing evaluation results annually to NSF as an accountability function, NSF grantees also need to provide evidence of project outcomes if they apply for another grant from NSF in the future. So if Jen goes back in a few years to NSF to request funding for a new project, she'll have to begin that proposal with a section called Results from Prior NSF Support. And she has up to 5 pages for that in her ATE proposal. And this subsection has to include evidence of specific outcomes and results and include metrics that demonstrate the impact of project activities. So here are 3 sets of statements that could show up in a results of prior support section in a future proposal that Jen submits. So I'd like you to take your time to read these examples and then answer the poll that's going to come up in just a minute, to indicate which one you think is the most compelling evidence of outcome. So I'm just going to stay quiet for about 90 seconds to give you all a chance to review, read these examples, and then make your selection. They'll come back in just a sec, don't worry. Here we go. Okay, if you haven't made your selection, you can go ahead and do that. Looks like we have quite a number of people who've been able to do it, and numbers are still going up. A couple more seconds. All right, Mike, if you could go ahead and broadcast those results so everyone can see how it went. Okay, I think they're broadcast now so everyone can see them. Okay, nobody picked, oh no, one person picked example A, all right, and we had a few people pick example B, and the vast majority picking example C. Well, let's think about why that was the case. So in example A, which will appear just in a second, they basically only said what they had been funded to do. So the lead of the ATE program, Celeste Carter, said this is really, well, not really common, but too common among ATE proposals. She said it's not unusual for people basically to copy and paste what was in their prior proposal just to say what they were funded to do. So you definitely do not want to do something like this. So example B, and just a few people selected it, but example B only reported on the project's activities. So it may have been a good reflection of productivity, but not outcomes. Now you may have been, some of you, enamored with the numbers there. It seemed like good data, right? But there actually wasn't any evidence of what happened to the students or anything else as a result of the activities. These weren't really at the level of outcomes. So you don't want to do something like this. Now, example C actually has evidence of what changes were brought about because of the project. So this is what you'd want to aim for. And most of you selected this, but I think all too often people are not going at it at this level. They're just describing what they did or what they were funded to do. Well, thanks for doing that. So if you want to know more about what goes into that results from prior support section, you can see our checklist on this topic. Actually, the first one there is about Asa's blog post. We have a link to her blog post that goes into a little more detail on how she learned from her evaluation. And then that next one is the results from prior support checklist. So it's going to have the NSF requirements as well as our, as in Evaluate, suggestions for getting the most out of this section of a proposal. Remember, this can be up to 5 pages. You saw just a very small snippet in those examples. So even if you're just thinking about submitting your first NSF proposal, or even if you're thinking about another funder, it's not too early to think about how you want to be able to talk about your accomplishments and your outcomes in the future. So Jen is getting the idea about why evaluation is important, but she's not sure who is supposed to do this work. So we're going to address that question next after we hear from Elaine and take some more of your questions. Go ahead, Elaine.
Oh, great, Lori. I would like to follow up on the slide that said, because of questions our evaluator asked, we have data to justify moving resources around in our budget. NSF actually expects PIs to pay attention to project data and to change objectives and strategies as needed to achieve goals and improve outcomes. I recall a project that prepared high school teachers to teach an introductory GIS course that would transfer to the college. This high school dual credit course was designed to create a pathway and incentive for students to pursue GIS at the community college. The initial grant plan was to prepare 24 high school teachers, 12 per summer. After the first summer workshop, however, teachers were found to be lacking confidence. They did not feel adequately prepared to teach the course. Teachers said they needed more instruction and practice. Teachers also indicated that if given the opportunity, they would come to a second workshop the next summer to learn more. This question about interest in more training was actually placed on the evaluator's survey to help the PI determine if another project proposal should be submitted to offer more advanced level training. Instead, the PI discovered a way to make the current project more successful. He made the decision, with his program officer's approval, to spend a second summer working with the initial cohort of 12 high school teachers rather than recruiting a second cohort of 12 teachers for the Year 2 workshop. The PI realized that having 12 teachers who were fully prepared and eager to teach the dual credit course would be more impactful than meeting the original project objective of preparing a total of 24 teachers, if the 24 participants would not really be ready to achieve the project's objective of offering the dual credit course. The bottom line is that the learning curve for participants was far steeper than the PI initially imagined, and evaluation data helped the PI adjust the project plan to match reality and to produce the desired outcomes that ultimately led to measurable student learning impacts. Mike, do we have any questions at this point?
Yes, Elaine, thanks. Let me follow up. Several of our attendees have asked, is there something that you can do during the project itself, in your experience, right? You've dealt with a lot of projects that will help improve the chances that you've got good, solid results of prior support. I mean, that's what we're gearing towards. We want to strengthen that section. Any suggestions for what you can do during a project to solidify that?
Well, Mike, it's certainly music to an evaluator's ear when a potential grantee is thinking about this even before the proposal is submitted. The most common way to continue working with your evaluator is to start early and you continue on to a next project. If you work with your evaluator to set your goals for your project in a way that well, first of all, let me back up a minute. Most people, when they start writing a project idea, a project plan, they're overly ambitious. This is particularly true with the small grants for those new to ATE. The plan is just far bigger than can be accomplished with the budget that's available and the time that you have. And so I like to tell people to consider that a vision. And within that vision, to pluck out a subset of that work that they would want to do first, or more importantly, that will likely lead to measurable outcomes sooner. People sometimes call this the low-hanging fruit. If you want to pick things that you, first of all, working with your evaluator and understanding what data is going to be available and needed, determine what you can do that you can get the data for and actually show the impact of your intervention or your change or your strategies in the time frame that you've got. There may be some longer-term goals, like in the example that Lori's sharing today, of impact on the workforce, that you do want to do that, and you do want to measure that, and you want to get to that end goal. But within this time frame, what are the first things you've got to do? You've got to get them in the programs, retain them in the programs, prepare them to be successful, and so forth. So set your early goals in a way that success is possible in the time frame and that you'll be able to demonstrate that. That would be my advice.
That's good. That's good thinking, Elaine. Thank you. Lori, our timing is good, but I do have time for one more question. It's a good one. You mentioned about, of course, cost of an evaluator and how to manage that. Does an evaluator have to be on site at some point? Can they be strictly virtual? What's your experience there?
I think Elaine would agree with me. I think we all would, with experience, who have experience in evaluation. It's always good to have some face time with your evaluator. I would definitely build in some visits to meet face to face. And that, as I mentioned, that can affect costs. Like, so if you're on the West Coast, I don't recommend you get an evaluator from the East Coast because it's going to eat up most of your budget. So yes, if they can spend some time on site working with you, maybe observing what's going on, maybe they need to collect data in person, but I would recommend at least periodic face-to-face meetings or site visits.
Good. Here's the last question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Lori, for you, last question for this session. Does the NSF, quote, approve your evaluator?
No, that is completely at the discretion of the project leaders. I think they would raise questions if it looked like somebody wasn't at all qualified. I think they're entitled to do that, but it really is, the selection is up to the evaluator, which transitions us nicely to the next topic, or an upcoming topic at least.
It does. Why don't you go ahead and take us forward?
Yeah, sure, thanks. Good questions. We're going to have another question break towards the end, so don't hesitate to add your questions into the chat. So who can do the evaluation, right? So Jen has a lot of smart people on your team, as I'm sure you all do, so she's wondering if she can just do it internally. Well, the answer to that question is no, because the ATE program specifically states that the evaluator has to be independent of the project. I'm actually not going to explain independence because I had already addressed that in one of the first questions. Now, believe it or not, evaluation really is a profession and a discipline unto itself. We actually have professional associations, our own scholarship and academic journals, and a whole lot of professionals who identify as evaluators. I think the American Evaluation Association has something like 7,000 members now, so there's a lot of us. Now, when looking for an evaluator, it's important to know that there really is no specific degree or certification or credential required to call oneself an evaluator. So anyone can put a sign up and say they're an evaluator. A big consulting firm can say evaluation is one of their specialties. But neither of these things ensures that they're qualified, and neither thing means they aren't qualified. So you have to be careful when selecting an evaluator. You want to find somebody with experience, of course. They want to have strong research skills. They should be a good communicator who's going to be responsive to your situation, and they should have an understanding of NSF and two-year colleges, at least for the ATE program. It's not always easy to find somebody with that mix of credentials. So we're going to help Jen select an evaluator for her project. So again, I'd like you to take a moment to review these credentials of 3 evaluators and then use the poll that will appear to make your recommendation about which one Jen should approach for her project. Now, if you have any reservations about your suggestion, you can use the chat to explain what your concerns are or what else you might want to know about the evaluator. So Mike will bring up the poll, and then you'll have a chance to put your answer in. Well, we have over 200 people on this webinar. That's incredible. So it takes a while for everybody's answers to go in. So I'll leave it open for, or I'll ask Mike to leave it open for just another second, and then we'll go ahead and broadcast the results. All right, Mike, can you broadcast those results? Thanks. All right, so most of you honed in on Evaluator B, and that was my selection too. So we're going to go in and pick apart why we may not have selected the others. So that first person, they seem to have good knowledge of two-year colleges, of technical education, student services, but I'd want to know more about their experience as an external evaluator of grant-funded projects. Now, accreditation is going to have a lot in common with the project evaluation, but it's not the same thing. Evaluator B looks like they have great credentials when it comes to evaluation, but I'd want to know how much time they have. And Vicki and Christopher and Mr. or Ms. Spalding, and another person whose name I can't pronounce, but all honed in on that same issue. How much time do they have? They're working on 25 other evaluations. That's a huge load. And I would suspect, given that workload, that they have a team behind them, which could be a good thing, but I'd want to know who's actually going to work on my project and what their credentials are, and will I be able to work with them effectively. Now, Evaluator C certainly knows two-year colleges and NSF, but it's not clear if they have the expertise needed when it comes to research methods and running evaluations. So I'd want to ask about those things. So for more guidance on how to select an evaluator, you can see our guide to finding and selecting an evaluator, which has links to additional information, including the evaluator map that was mentioned in the chat. Of course, the link is on our handout. Now, keep in mind you must have an independent evaluator, but that doesn't mean you can't do some of the work internally. The evaluator can be responsible for the more technical things like data collection, analysis, and the project team can provide assistance with data collection. And they really are in the best position to keep track of who's involved in the project and what the project is doing. Together, they can plan the evaluation, interpret the results. The project team can facilitate data collection. And these things aren't about just cutting costs. It's about making sure the evaluation is really relevant in the context. So our friend Jen is warming up to this idea of having her project evaluated, but she's not clear how it's supposed to go in her proposal. So she knows to check NSF's Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide, lovingly known as the PAPPG in the NSF circles, but it doesn't provide any guidance on how to address the evaluation's external, or the project's external evaluation. I want you to think of your proposal as a puzzle, and all the pieces need to fit tightly with each other, including the evaluation piece. So here's all the required elements of an NSF proposal, and these checks identify areas where there's going to need to be information related to the evaluation. But we're just going to hone in on the project description. This is the main part of an NSF proposal. It can be up to 15 pages long. And the contents I have listed here are based on guidance from both the ATE program solicitation and that PAPPG. The sections of this description where you're definitely going to need information related to your evaluation are that results from prior support section, which we've already discussed, and of course the evaluation plan. Of that 15-page description, 1 to 3 pages should be dedicated to evaluation. That's coming from me, not NSF. I'd aim for about 1.5 pages unless you have a good reason for it to be longer or shorter than that. And in this small space, you need to identify who your evaluators, if you can do that in advance of funding according to your institution's policies. Also, what the evaluation questions would be, what data will be collected, and how it will be used to answer those evaluation questions, what types of reports or other deliverables will be prepared, and when all this is going to happen. And the webinar we have each August goes into a lot more detail on all of this, so I hope you'll come back for that. In the meantime, there's a lot of information on how to build evaluation into your proposal in our comprehensive ATE evaluation planning checklist. And for specific guidance on how to organize the evaluation section specifically, you can see our evaluation plan template. So hopefully we've taken some of the mystery out of evaluation, but this has all been about what happens before a project gets funded. You may still be wondering what happens after you get your award, so I'll take a moment just to touch on that a bit. So generally speaking, each year of a grant, the evaluation is going to go through a cycle of data collection, analysis, and reporting, and also facilitating use of the evaluation results to make adjustments as needed for the work of the coming year. Now in year 1, as you can see, there's more time dedicated to planning. And it's definitely a good idea to meet with the evaluator during this phase. Planning phase is going to involve establishing that formal agreement with an evaluator in the project's institution. Then the evaluator is going to work with the client to develop a more concrete, actionable plan, because that 1.5 pages in the proposal just isn't enough detail to be a guide to implementing the evaluation. And this is also a time to establish a relationship with the college's institutional research office to find out what data they'll be able to provide, how best to work with that office, and even start obtaining baseline data. Most projects are going to require some original data collection instruments or protocols to develop, so those are going to have to be created during this time as well and tested. So that's going to happen in the planning phase. After all that, then the primary data collection can finally begin, anything that wasn't provided by the institution. Now that first evaluation report is going to need to be delivered in advance of the project's first annual report to NSF. So that happens actually pretty quickly. And you may not have a lot of exciting results to show at that point, but it still needs to be produced and delivered to NSF. Then the data collection, analysis, and reporting cycle can repeat itself annually with periodic meetings and certainly ongoing communication between the project team and the evaluator. To make sure you get a good plan in place for working with an evaluator, you can use our communication plan checklist, specifically for ATE principal investigators and evaluators. When evaluations fail, it's often due just to poor communication or misunderstandings between the evaluator and the project team. And this little checklist can help you work through some of those issues to avoid those kinds of problems. Well, Jen is feeling pretty good about having her project evaluated now. I hope you are too. We're going to hear more comments from Elaine. Then we're going to have our last question break. And please stick around for that, as well as our new and improved webinar evaluation survey, which is really important to us. So go ahead, Elaine.
Okay, thanks, Lori. My last tale from the trench today, or trenches, is I'd like to emphasize again working with your project evaluator well in advance of submitting your proposal. Doing so will likely make your proposal more competitive. For an example, an evaluator can help you craft stronger goals and objectives around your ideas. An evaluator will also help you look at the data required to evaluate each goal so that adjustments can be made based on data availability. An example might be the number of veterans in a target program. You may assume that your institution has veteran status data for each student. More likely than not, however, answering a college application question about military service and veteran status is optional, and many veterans choose not to report. That means that using institutional data to track veterans in a program may result in underreporting the impact of your project work on veteran recruitment and retention. There may be other ways to capture this data, but knowing that it may be an issue is the type of awareness an evaluator can bring to the grant development process. Another point is that you may need to look into not only what data are available from your institutional research, but also how long it will take to get the data once your request is submitted. There is an inherent time lag in data capture and availability. In addition, requests for institutional data that are not already routinely reported requires more time, since queries will need to be built to extract data that are specific to your project. So it is important to consider what will be feasible within the time span of your project and what the data reporting schedule will need to be. The message here is that working with an evaluator during grant development will encourage you to think about evaluation throughout the proposal development process and consider your data needs in advance. Mike, I think we now may be ready for our last question break.
Thank you, Elaine. You just mentioned interacting with an evaluator during grant development, but let me turn this question first to Lori. Lori, are there standards or best practices that one can use to get an evaluator involved at the proposal development stage? Are we asking them to contribute at no cost to the evaluation plan? Are we guaranteeing them anything? I know it's a complicated question, but what's your thoughts there?
Well, it is complicated, so I can speak from my experience. It certainly does not apply, across the board. But, I work in an evaluation center, so we'll often have projects approach us saying, hey, we're developing this proposal. Can you assist us with the evaluation section? And so then we'll look at their plans, if we agree. We'll look at their plans. We'll develop an evaluation plan tailored to their project plan. Typically we would write that up for them, which they may need to adjust, something depending on how much space they have. And then we submit a budget, letter of commitment, and then we wait 6-8 months to hear if they got the funding, and then they let us know, hey, we got the funding, we're ready to work with you, and then a contracting procedure takes place. Some colleges have tricky rules about that, and they're not allowed to pick an evaluator without a bid process, and then it gets more complicated. But there is like an unwritten kind of expectation that, you can ask an evaluator to assist in writing an evaluation section at no cost, with the understanding that if the project is awarded, they will get the contract to do the evaluation. That is my direct experience.
Elaine, I know you have experience in this area too. It's true, I think, that the NSF wants to see who the evaluator is, and yet, as Lori mentioned, there may be bid or purchasing requirements that forbade that, so to speak. What's your experience there, Elaine?
Well, generally, it's the same as Lori's. It's really great when you can partner in advance. You have an agreement to help them, and then you, contract to work with them if they get funded. Sometimes that's not possible. I have worked with colleges that actually had to contract to get that evaluation work done for the proposal. And not only was there a bid process involved when the grant was awarded, this happened to be a Department of Labor project, but the evaluator, in our case, it was us, me, we were not eligible bidders because we had helped develop the proposal. Fortunately, NSF does not have that requirement the way the DOL did, and so it is possible for you to contract with an evaluator to help you during proposal and then another contract if you get funded. So it really depends a lot on the institution. And it also sometimes depends on how you're going to pay that evaluator. If you include an evaluation contract and include an evaluator as a subaward in your project, sometimes the procurement is easier than if you contract with them as a contractor. It just depends on the procurement rules in your state, but because the subawards are specifically named in the grant award from NSF, that very often creates a sole source justification so that you can contract with the evaluator you've been working with. but it really is a case-by-case basis on this. You just have to find out what your college procurement rules and regulations are and what you can and can't do.
Well, thank you, Elaine. We appreciate that. And Lori, your comments there. I know it's not a trivial question, and it swirls around, and it's important that each of us check with our own college's financial as well as grant development offices about that sort of issue. Colleagues, we've now come to the end of our survey. Remember, this webinar will be recorded, and you'll automatically get a link to the recording. So what I'm going to do right now as we wrap up today is to launch that survey. And here's what's going to happen, I hope. I'm going to click on the survey link, and this is going to open in a new window on your computer. So a new window opens up, and you'll see something that says Webinar Evaluation Basics for Non-Evaluators, and there's some survey links that you can click. Now, I have to tell you that some computers, some systems don't always open up this survey. So what you can do, I'm going to put the survey link in the chat window, and then you can click on that in the chat window and take you there directly. You know how these various computer systems are a little weird. So you can see that bit.ly Evaluation March 18th survey. Colleagues, I wanted to thank you for joining today. Remember, you will get an email with the link to the recording, the slides, the handout. I'd like to acknowledge all of the work that our principal presenter, Lori Wingate, did on this webinar, and as well as thanking our colleague Elaine Kraft with all of her experience from the trenches. Elaine, thank you to give us insight there. So colleagues, we're going to go ahead and close down the audio system today. Going to close down the recording, and I'll leave the system open for a few minutes so that we can give you time to finish that survey. Thank you for joining us today. Please look forward to our future webinars. Look at that Evaluate website to find the upcoming webinars in April and beyond. Thank you again. Goodbye, everyone.